Edna Mae Hargrove thought it was just a loose floorboard. She'd stepped over that soft spot in her grandmother's bedroom floor 100 times. But on a cold November morning, 11 weeks after the funeral, she pressed down on it one last time and heard the note Grandma had left inside the tin box begin with the words, "If you found this, they are still doing it." It was a Saturday, 8:04 in the morning. Lily stood in that empty bedroom in boots 2 sizes too large, her grandmother's boots stuffed with newspaper at the toe, holding a tin box that weighed almost nothing and somehow weighed everything. For 37 years, Edna Mae Hargrove had collected what no one else would touch. She had tried every door she knew. And when the last door closed, she hid the evidence under her floor and wrote a note to a grandchild she was raising to be braver than she had been. Lily had exactly 6 days before a child she'd never met would be lost to a system with no way back, a system that had been taking children from Milford Creek, Kentucky, since before her mother was born. All she had was a tin box, a dead woman's handwriting, and one instruction: find the bikers on Route 9. This is Lily's story, and it doesn't end the way Gerald Whitfield thought it would. Before we go further, if this story moves you, if it reminds you that courage doesn't come with an age requirement, hit that subscribe button right now. Because here on Valiant Bikers, this is what we do. We find the stories that restore what the world tries to take from you. The bedroom at 214 Cinder Hill Road still smelled like her grandmother. Lavender powder and old paperback books, and something warm that Lily couldn't name. Only feel. The bed had been stripped by her mother 3 weeks ago. The curtains were still there, yellow with tiny white flowers, faded from years of morning light. Edna Mae Hargrove had loved mornings. Lily had found the tin box on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, she had read everything inside it twice. By Thursday, she had copied names and dates into a spiral notebook with a purple cover. Her school notebook, the one she'd emptied out and turned face down in her desk so no one would look inside. By Friday, she had tried every door her 11-year-old world had available to her. Her mother first. Carol Hargrove was 38 years old and worked the early shift at the Milford Creek Family Dollar, and came home tired in a way that lived behind her eyes even when she smiled. She had loved her mother. She was still grieving in the quiet way that doesn't announce itself. Losing things she didn't expect to lose, like her coffee cup, like her keys, like the thread of a sentence halfway through. When Lily set the tin box on the kitchen table, Carol had held it in both hands and sat with it for 3 full minutes. Then she said, "Lily, baby, Mama had paranoid spells near the end. You know that." She set the box on the highest kitchen shelf, patted Lily's hand, made them both hot chocolate. Lily waited until her mother was asleep and stood on the step stool and took it back. Deputy Sheriff Mike Trent at the Milford Creek Precinct was 44 years old and had the kind of face that had been friendly once and was now just professional. He looked at the copied pages Lily laid on his desk. Neat stacks, rubber-banded by year, exactly as Edna had organized them. And he looked at them for 47 seconds. Lily counted. She'd been counting things to calm herself since she was 7, a trick her grandmother taught her. Count what you can see. It means you're still here. "This is real old, sweetheart," Deputy Trent said. He handed the pages back without writing a single word. "And you can't bring me photocopies of something your grandma kept under a floorboard. That's not how evidence works." He said it the way adults say things to children when they've already decided the child is wrong. Pastor Glenn Merritt listened with his hands folded and his head tilted, that particular tilt that meant he was performing attention. He was 56, silver-haired, and he had conducted Edna Mae Hargrove's funeral service 3 months ago, and called her a pillar of this community in front of 90 people. He knew the name Whitfield the moment Lily said it. She saw it move across his face, a small tightening, there and gone. The Whitfields have put food on tables and children in loving homes for 60 years in this county, Lily, he said. His voice was kind. That was the worst part. Grief does things to how we see the world. You come find me Sunday, and we'll talk about healing. He called Gerald Whitfield, Jr. within the hour. Lily didn't know this yet. That evening, a black Chevrolet Suburban drove slowly past the house on Cinder Hill Road. Headlights on. Then it circled back, headlights off that time, and moved past again at walking pace before turning at the end of the lane. Lily sat at her bedroom window and watched it and understood. Every door she'd been told to use led back to the same man. The system wasn't broken. The system was his. She opened the tin box again and read the last page of her grandmother's note. She had read it 6 times already. But this time, she read the one line she'd been skipping because it frightened her. Find the bikers on Route 9. People say they are frightening. They are not. They protect. I have watched them. Take the box, show them everything. Lily looked out the window at the dark lane. Then she looked at her grandmother's boots by the bedroom door. She picked them up, stuffed 2 more sheets of newspaper into the toes, and set them beside her bed for the morning. She didn't sleep much. But she didn't need to. She already knew what she was going to do. Rooster's roadside diner and fuel stop sat at the junction of Route 9 and County Road 14, like it had always been there and always would be. A low building with a neon coffee cup in the window that buzzed faintly when it got cold, and a gravel lot wide enough for semis and bike runs alike. On Saturday mornings, it smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee, and the particular cold that comes in every time the front door opens and refuses to leave. Lily had walked the 1.5 miles from Cinder Hill Road in the dark. She arrived at 7:58 a.m. She stood in the gravel lot for 4 minutes, looking at the bikes lined up along the far edge, 6 of them, black and chrome, breathtaking in their size even standing still. Through the window she could see the men who belonged to them. Big men in leather vests over flannel, plates of eggs half-finished, coffee cups being refilled. 6 of them at the long corner table. She watched them through the glass for 4 full minutes before she went inside. She was looking for the one who was reading. There was only one. He'd pushed his plate to the side and was working through the local paper. A coffee cup near his right hand, unhurried in a way that felt different from the others. Not bored, just settled. He had a scar along his jaw that caught the light when he turned a page. His hands were large and looked like they'd fixed 1,000 things. He had not once looked toward the door. Lily had always trusted people who didn't need to watch the door. She went in. The warmth hit her immediately, griddle heat and coffee steam. The waitress looked up from behind the counter. 2 men at the counter turned. The corner table noticed her the way large, watchful people notice a small thing moving through a room, not with alarm, but with attention. Lily walked in a straight line. She stopped every 12 steps to scan. Then she walked again. She'd been doing this since Cinder Hill Road. She didn't know she was doing it. She stopped at the edge of the corner table. She looked at the man with the newspaper. He hadn't looked up yet. She said, "My grandma said you people protect." 7 words. She had rehearsed them so many times they had stopped sounding like words. Now, standing here, they felt like dropping something heavy that she'd been carrying uphill. The man folded his newspaper closed, set it on the table. He did not move away. He reached out with one hand and pulled the empty chair beside him, not across from him, but beside him, and set it facing her. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what you brought with you." His name was Raymond Calloway. Road name, Crow. 54 years old. Road captain of the Appalachian chapter. 19 years patched. He ran a salvage yard outside Milford Creek and had lived in this county for 23 years and had paid the heating bills for 3 elderly neighbors, without telling them, for the past 4 winters. He had never spoken publicly about his younger sister, who was taken from his family in 1978 and whose name he had spent 46 years not knowing. He didn't know yet that the child standing in front of him was about to hand him the thread. Lily sat. She took off the backpack. She opened it carefully, both hands, the way she'd practiced. She lifted out the tin box and set it on the table in the clear space Crow had made by moving his coffee and his newspaper without being asked. She opened the tin box. Inside, rubber-banded stacks organized by year, each labeled in Edna Mae Hargrove's neat cursive. A hand-drawn chart of names and dates. Carbon copies of documents, some blurry, some sharp, photographed through office windows over the course of decades. A small notebook, spine cracked from use, filled with handwriting that got smaller and more careful as the years went on, as if Edna had understood that every word needed to count, and there might not be space for careless ones. And on top of everything, a folded page in a sealed envelope, addressed in shaking cursive to, "Whoever finds this, I believe in you." Crow looked at the box for a long moment. He did not touch it. He looked at Lily. "Walk me through it," he said. "Take your time." So she did. She told him about the floorboard, and the morning she found it, and the smell of the room. She told him about her mother and the kitchen shelf, and the hot chocolate, and waiting until the house went quiet to take the box back. She told him about Deputy Trent's 47 seconds, and the way he handed the pages back without writing a single word. She told him about Pastor Glenn, and the tilt of his head, and the Suburban with the headlights off. She told him about the Henderson placement, a name on a document near the top of the 2025 stack. A date, the 14th, 6 days from today. She did not cry. She had used those up. She told him last about Margaret Elaine Pruitt, 22 years old in 1987, who had come to Edna in tears after signing papers at the Whitfield Foundation, believing she was getting temporary support, and had her infant son gone within 72 hours. Who had filed 3 formal complaints in 15 years and been told each time, voluntary relinquishment confirmed. Who was now 59 years old and living in Harlan County, and, Lily had looked her up, had never stopped searching. "My grandma spent 37 years building this case," Lily said, "and nobody would take it. And then she died." She paused. "And she left it for me because she didn't know who else." The table was quiet. One of the other brothers had put his coffee cup down. Another had turned his chair slightly. Nobody spoke. Crow had not moved during the entire story. His hands were flat on the table, visible, still. He had listened the way very few adults listen to children, without deciding anything until the child was finished. Now he reached into his vest pocket and set his phone face down on the table, not to check it, to put it away. "There's one more thing," Lily said. She reached into the front pocket of the backpack and produced a folded paper towel. She spread it carefully on the table. Handwriting, someone else's, hurried, real. "The cleaning lady at his office. She heard him on the phone. She left this at our mailbox because she saw his car go past our house." Crow read the paper towel. His jaw shifted once, barely visible. He passed it to his left without a word. The brother who'd turned his chair, broad-shouldered, 50-something, a face that had seen a long career somewhere official, read it and set it down carefully, the way you set down something that has just become evidence. Crow placed his right hand flat on the table between them. Palm up, not reaching, not demanding. An offering. "I'm with you. You don't have to carry this alone." Lily looked at his hand. Then she picked up the tin box and placed it in it. "Your grandma was right," Crow said. "We protect." He said it the way you say something you have always believed but rarely needed to say out loud. Then he looked at the brother to his left. "Wrench. Call the Tennessee chapter." He looked at the next. "Doc, we need someone who knows adoption law tonight." He looked at the youngest. "Smoke, I need everything public on the Whitfield Foundation. 990s, licensing, court filings, any name connected to that organization. Before noon." He looked at the man at the far end of the table, oldest of them all, 71, white-haired, who hadn't spoken since Lily came through the door. "Elder," Crow said. The old man nodded once. "I'll make the calls." Lily sat very still. She was watching something she had never seen before. A room full of people responding to what she had said, as if it mattered. As if she mattered. As if her grandmother's 37 years of careful, quiet, frightened courage mattered. She pressed her fingers together under the table, index finger, middle finger, thumb, and counted the sounds in the room. Griddle hiss. Coffee cup. The low rumble of Route 9, 6 phones coming out of 6 pockets. She was still here. She was counting what she could see. Outside, through the diner window, the bikes sat in the cold morning light, chrome catching what little sun there was. In 6 hours, there would be more. In 12 hours, there would be brothers driving in from 2 states. In 6 days, if everything held. If the evidence held. If Margaret Pruitt answered her phone. If the storage unit on Route 14 contained what Edna's notes said it contained, a child whose name Lily didn't know would not disappear. Edna Mae Hargrove had never seen the inside of Rooster's diner. She had watched those bikes on Route 9 for years from a careful distance, gathering her courage, waiting for the right moment. The right moment never came for her. She had made sure it would come for her granddaughter. By 9:15 a.m., Rooster's diner had cleared out. The waitress, a woman named Patsy, who had worked that counter for 11 years and had seen enough Saturday mornings to know when something was different about this one, refilled Lily's hot chocolate without being asked, and didn't ask any questions. She turned the radio down low. She gave the corner table its space. Crow had moved the tin box to the center of the table. Wrench. Dale Stubbs, 52, former Kentucky State Police, 18 years on the force, the kind of man who knew how document fraud worked because he had prosecuted it, was going through the stacks methodically. Not fast, not rushed. The way a man works when he understands that speed and accuracy are not the same thing, and only one of them holds up in court. He didn't speak for 23 minutes. When he did, he said, "She built a case. This woman actually built a case." He said it quietly, not to anyone in particular. It was the kind of sentence that comes out when a professional recognizes craftsmanship. Edna Mae Hargrove had organized her evidence the way someone organizes things when they know no one will help them carry it, with absolute clarity, because if she wasn't there to explain it, it still had to make sense on its own. Each rubber-banded year contained a date, a name, a notation in her cursive. M.W., signed papers 3/4, baby gone 3/6, copy of receipt attached. And wherever she had managed it, a physical copy, carbon paper, photographs taken through windows, a receipt here, a court document there, pulled from public records at the county clerk's office, which Edna had visited twice a year for 3 decades, always on different days, always dressed for church, so no one would think to look twice at her. There were 11 families documented with enough evidence to name. 6 more she had marked with a small question mark and the word verify. She had names but hadn't been able to confirm the outcome. And at the bottom of the 1987 stack, Margaret Elaine Pruitt. Age 22 at time of placement. Infant son, male, born April 3rd. A receipt carbon for $2,800 marked Support Stipend, Whitfield Foundation. And a single handwritten note from Edna, dated May 1987, in writing that was steadier than the later years. Margaret came to me again tonight. She is asking at the courthouse, but they are sending her away. I don't know what to do. I don't know who to tell. I am afraid. Smoke. Jake Reeves, 29. Army intelligence background, the youngest at the table by a decade, had his laptop open and was moving through the Whitfield Foundation's publicly available IRS Form 990 filings. Nonprofit organizations are required by law to file these annually. They are public record. Most people don't know that. 11 years of filings, he said, not looking up. Revenue goes up every 3 to 4 years in irregular jumps, not gradual. Jump, plateau, jump. That's not a growing donation base. That's a pricing change. He turned the screen. Most recent year, $312,000 in program service revenue. That's the line they use for placement fees. Against $47,000 per placement, that's between 6 and 7 placements per year. What do legitimate agencies charge? Crow asked. 8 to 25,000, depending on services. Licensed. The Whitfield Foundation's state license, Smoke added, expired in 2021. Wasn't renewed. They're operating on an administrative extension that's been rubber-stamped by the Cabinet for Health and Family Services every 6 months. The last actual compliance review, 2017. Doc, Samuel Pierce, 61. Retired social worker, 22 years with family services, was reading the adoption law section on his phone. He had put on reading glasses and was doing it the way he'd done everything in his career. Carefully, without performing urgency. Consent given without independent legal counsel present is challengeable in Kentucky, especially with evidence of misrepresentation. He looked up. If those documents show 2 things signed simultaneously, temporary placement and voluntary relinquishment, and the mother has testimony that she believed she was only signing one of them, that's fraud. That is prosecutable fraud, federal, if it crossed state lines. Did any of these placements cross state lines? Crow asked. Smoke was already looking. 3 of the receiving families in the 9900's list out-of-state addresses, 1 in Ohio, 2 in Tennessee. He paused. That makes this an FBI matter. The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when a thing becomes real. Lily was sitting at the far end, both hands wrapped around her hot chocolate cup. She was listening to everything. She had stopped counting floor tiles 20 minutes ago. She didn't need to. The storage unit, Wrench said. He was reading Edna's notation in the 1989 stack. G.W. Sr., Box Archive, Clearview, Unit Unknown, Route 14. Told to me by A.K., Clerk. A.K., Lily said. Everyone looked at her. Arthur Kimball, she said. He's in Grandma's notebook. She wrote about him 3 times. Retired county clerk. She said he processed some of the old paperwork and didn't understand what he was signing off on until later. She said he felt terrible about it. Wrench looked at Crow. If Kimball will talk, he'll talk, Crow said. He said it without doubt, the way you say things when you've spent a long time learning the difference between people who won't speak and people who haven't been asked the right way yet. He stood. He picked up his phone. Schoolhouse, he said to Thomas Avery. 47, former high school history teacher, the one with the quiet voice that made people feel like everything could be explained and nothing was hopeless. Stay with Lily. Don't leave her. Schoolhouse nodded. He moved his chair to sit beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, Your grandmother's handwriting is very clear. That must have taken a lot of patience. Lily looked at the open tin box. She was a very patient person, she said. Her voice was steady. She said that patience is just courage that doesn't make noise. Schoolhouse nodded slowly. That's worth writing down. Arthur Kimball lived on Depot Street in a house he'd owned for 41 years. He was 71 and had a vegetable garden in the backyard that he tended even in November, covering the beds with burlap and checking them every morning because the habit was too old to break. He had worked as a circuit court clerk from 1974 to 2008 and had spent the last 18 years carrying a specific guilt. The kind you can't confess because the person you'd confess it to was never supposed to be hurt in the first place, and the damage has long since compounded beyond what your confession can touch. When Crow knocked on his door at 10:30 that morning, Arthur Kimball looked at the man on his front step for a long moment. Then he looked past him at the bikes on the street. Then he opened the door wide. I've been expecting someone like you, he said. I just thought it would be sooner. He sat at his kitchen table and told them everything in the organized, careful way of a man who has rehearsed a confession so many times it has become a kind of grief. In 1978, in 1982, in 1984, he had processed paperwork for Gerald Whitfield Sr. that he had believed was standard. It had looked standard. The language was technical and dense, the way legal documents always were, and Gerald Sr. had always been present, professional, patient with explanations. The first time I understood what I'd done, Arthur said, was 1989. A woman came to the clerk's office asking for records of a voluntary relinquishment she said she'd never signed. I pulled the file. Her signature was on it. Her real signature, not forged. But the look on her face when she saw it. He stopped, pressed his lips together. She didn't know what she'd signed. She thought she was signing a temporary arrangement. He folded his hands. I went to Gerald Sr. He told me the woman was unstable. He told me her baby was safe and thriving. He told me to think about my family. Arthur looked at his hands. I had 3 kids under 10. I went home, and I kept going home. For 35 years I kept going home. He had known about the storage unit since 1991. Gerald Sr. had mentioned it once, casually, the way powerful men mention things casually to let you know they are keeping records that could implicate you. Everything goes into the archive, Arthur. All our history, nice and organized. Clearview Self-Storage, Route 14, Unit 34. Arthur Kimball had never gone near it. He had spent 30 years hoping no one else would either. I'll testify, he said, before anyone asked. Whatever you need, I'll testify. Nora Sizemore had left the paper towel at the Hargrove mailbox at 6:40 a.m. that same Saturday on her way to her sister's house. She was 58 years old and had cleaned the Whitfield Foundation offices for 4 years and had known for most of those 4 years that something was wrong in the way that people who work in buildings know things, not through documents or testimony, but through the quality of the silences, through what got locked and what stayed locked, through the way Mr. Whitfield smiled at mothers and watched them sign and then never spoke about them again after they left. She had heard the phone call on a Tuesday evening, staying late to finish the back hallway. She had written on the paper towel because it was what she had. She had folded it 6 times. She had held it for 3 days before leaving it at the mailbox. When Wrench reached her by phone at 11:15 a.m., she was at her sister's kitchen table, eating a bowl of soup, and had been waiting for this call the way you wait for something you've already decided to do, but haven't quite made happen yet. I heard what he said, she told Wrench. Her voice was clear and certain. I wrote it down exactly. I don't make things up. We know, Wrench said. Can you tell me one more time, in your own words, what you heard him say about the Henderson placement? He said the court date needed to be locked before anyone started looking. He said a specific date, the 14th. He said Patricia, that's the judge, I've heard that name before, needed to have everything ready. She paused. And he said the ledger didn't exist unless someone found the unit. And then he said that thing about the little girl's grandmother. She recited it from memory, exactly as she'd written it. Edna Hargrove was a paranoid old woman, and she died a paranoid old woman. Her granddaughter is going to go home, cry, and grow up. That's what children do. The line landed on Wrench's end of the call, the way it had landed on Crow's end of the table that morning. In absolute silence. Ms. Sizemore, Wrench said, I'm going to need you to come in and make a formal statement. We have people who can help you do that safely. I know, she said. I already packed a bag. Clearview Self-Storage on Route 14 had 17 cameras covering the lot and the access road, which meant approaching it directly without legal authorization would immediately alert Gerald Whitfield or anyone monitoring the property. Smoke had the layout mapped within the hour. Wrench had the name of a federal contact, a former colleague now with the FBI field office in Lexington, in his phone. The call to Lexington was made at 12:47 p.m. The agent on the other end listened for 6 minutes without interrupting. When Wrench finished, there was a pause. The interstate placements make this federal, the agent said. I need the 990 Kent data, the paper towel with chain of custody documentation, and a signed statement from your witness before I can move. How fast can you get me those? Before close of business today, Wrench said. Then I can have a warrant application before a federal judge Monday morning. If the unit contains what your source says it contains. It does, Wrench said. The woman who documented it spent 37 years being right about everything. She was just wrong about who would listen. Another pause. Get me the materials, the agent said. And tell whoever has the child to keep her somewhere safe this weekend." Margaret Elaine Pruitt Dawson answered her phone on the second ring. Doc had made the call. He had been in family services for 22 years and had delivered news to people, good news, devastating news, impossible news, more times than he could count. He knew that there was no preparation for this particular kind of call. You could only be honest and stay on the line. "Ms. Pruitt Dawson, my name is Samuel Pierce. I'm calling because I'm sitting with a tin box that belongs to Edna Mae Hargrove, your neighbor from Milford Creek, and I think you should know what's inside it." The silence on the other end lasted 11 seconds. Doc counted. "Edna," Margaret said. Her voice was very quiet. "Is Edna—" "She passed away," Doc said gently. 11 weeks ago. But she spent 37 years keeping records. Records about you and your son. About what was done to you in 1987. And we have those records now." There were 9 seconds of silence. Then Margaret Pruitt Dawson, 59 years old, who had filed 3 formal complaints and been told 3 times that what she knew had happened had never happened, began to cry. Not in a way that sounded like grief. In a way that sounded like something that had been pressed down for 37 years, suddenly finding air. "She believed me," Margaret said. "All this time, she believed me." "She did more than believe you," Doc said. "She proved it." Gerald Harlan Whitfield, Jr. was arrested at 4:18 p.m. on a Tuesday, 4 days after Lily walked into Rooster's Diner, 2 days before the Henderson placement was scheduled to finalize. He was in the parking lot of Milford Creek Community Church, carrying a foil-covered dish for a potluck supper. He was wearing pressed khakis and a flannel shirt and reading glasses on a lanyard. He looked, in every detail, like what he had spent 61 years building himself to look like. A respectable man who had never done anything that a reasonable person would question. The agents who approached him from either side were calm and quiet and professional. One of them said his name. One of them said the charges: wire fraud, adoption fraud, fraudulent misrepresentation, conspiracy to commit fraud. 17 counts. Expanding pending review of the Unit 34 archive, which had been opened under federal warrant at 2:30 that afternoon. The ledger was inside. Rubber banded by year. Gerald Sr.'s handwriting through 1991. Gerald Jr.'s from 1992 onward. 62 years of records. Everything Edna had suspected, and more that she hadn't known. Gerald Whitfield, Jr. set the foil-covered dish on the roof of his car. He did not speak. He looked at the handcuffs with an expression that was almost curious, as if this were an administrative problem that could be managed, the way all problems in his life had been managed. It couldn't. Judge Patricia Howes was placed on immediate judicial suspension pending investigation into 31 adoption proceedings. Deputy Sheriff Mike Trent was placed on administrative leave. Pastor Glenn Merritt received a formal inquiry from the Kentucky Attorney General's office regarding his role in alerting Gerald Whitfield to Lily's visit. The Henderson placement was halted by court order at 9:07 a.m. on Monday morning, 72 hours before the paperwork would have been finalized. The child's mother, 24 years old, in a financial crisis, who had believed she was signing a temporary arrangement, was contacted by a state family services advocate and a pro bono family attorney arranged through Doc's network. She had not slept since she signed the papers. When the attorney called to tell her the placement had been stopped and her child was coming home, She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I thought I was doing the right thing." "You were trying to," the attorney said. "Someone stopped the people who were taking advantage of that." There is a moment in every story like this one, not at the arrest, not at the moment the warrant is signed, but earlier, quieter, when the thing that felt impossible becomes simply true. When the weight that one person carried for years is finally distributed among hands strong enough to hold it. For this story, that moment happened at a diner table on a Saturday morning, when a man named Crow set a tin box down carefully and said, "Your grandma was right." Edna Mae Hargrove had been right about all of it. The scheme, the scale, the names, the man with the pressed khakis and the reading glasses on a lanyard. The judge, the pastor, the deputy who took 47 seconds to decide a child's evidence wasn't worth writing down. She had been right about one more thing, too, the thing she had written in shaking cursive at the bottom of her last note, the line Lily had been skipping because it frightened her, and then stopped skipping because she needed it. Do not be afraid of how they look. Be afraid of men who smile in church and steal babies. 143 Hell's Angels made that sentence true in Milford Creek, Kentucky, on a cold November weekend. Not through force, not through intimidation, through evidence and phone calls and a retired state trooper who knew document fraud law, and a 29-year-old who knew how to read a nonprofit's IRS filing, and an old man named Elder who had been riding Route 9 in 1987 when the first baby was taken and had carried the not knowing of it ever since. Through a cleaning woman who packed a bag before anyone asked her to, through a man named Crow who placed his hand palm up on a table and waited. The Kentucky Cabinet for Health and Family Services opened a formal review of all 62 years of Whitfield Foundation records on the Wednesday following the arrest. The FBI field office in Lexington assigned 2 additional agents to the case by Thursday. By Friday, the story had reached Louisville, and then Nashville, and then, by the following Monday, had been picked up by the Associated Press under a headline that said, "Kentucky nonprofit charged with decades of adoption fraud. Federal investigation expanding." In Milford Creek, the headline felt distant, abstract. The kind of language that turns something real into something official, which is necessary, but not the same thing. What was real happened in smaller rooms, in smaller moments, with fewer words. Margaret Elaine Pruitt Dawson drove up from Harlan County on the Thursday after the arrest. She had not been back to Milford Creek in 21 years. She had left after her third formal complaint was closed, after the last door shut, and had built a life in Harlan County with a husband named Frank and 2 daughters who knew their mother had a son somewhere and had grown up watching her carry that knowledge with quiet, unceasing love. Doc met her at the county line and drove with her to where Crow and Lily were waiting. Not at a government office, not at a lawyer's conference room, but at Rooster's Diner. The same corner table. Patsy had put out a fresh pot of coffee and a plate of the shortbread cookies she only made for people she wanted to take care of. Margaret was 59 and small-framed and had eyes that had done a lot of looking. She walked in the door and saw the tin box on the table. Edna's tin box, the rubber-banded stacks visible through the open lid, and stopped in the middle of the diner floor and pressed both hands over her mouth. Lily stood up from her chair. She didn't know Margaret, She had only known her name from Edna's handwriting. But she had read that name so many times in the past 2 weeks that it had become something she felt responsible for. A name that her grandmother had carried, and that she had carried after her, and that now needed to be set down in the right place. She picked up the receipt carbon from the 1987 stack. The one marked Support Stipend, $2,800, Monsieur Pruitt. She walked across the diner floor and held it out. "My grandma kept this," Lily said. "She kept everything about you. She wanted someone to know it was real." Margaret took the paper with both hands. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Lily, at the daisy patch on the green corduroy jacket, at the boots 2 sizes too large, at the braids coming slightly loose on the left side. "How old are you?" she asked. 11, Lily said. Margaret knelt down on the diner floor, which is not easy at 59, and she took Lily's face in both hands. "Your grandmother was the only person in this county who believed me for 37 years, she said. "And she sent you, of all the people she could have sent." Lily's chin moved once, just once. "She said, 'You people protect,'" she said. The same 7 words, but quieter now. Not a plea this time, just a fact. Something that had been proven. Margaret pulled her close and held her, there in the middle of Rooster's diner, and Patsy turned and found something to do behind the counter that required her to face the wall, and Doc looked at the ceiling. And even Crow, who had been a combat engineer and a road captain, and a man who had learned to keep his face still in rooms full of difficulty, had to set his coffee cup down and look out the window at Route 9 for a long moment. The search for Margaret's son, now 37 years old, somewhere in Ohio or Tennessee, was opened as part of the federal investigation. It would not be fast. These things rarely are. The receiving families had their own complexity, their own histories, their own truths that would take time and care to navigate. Doc was already in contact with a family reunification specialist in Louisville. The Child Welfare Information Gateway had resources specifically for adoptees and birth parents separated under fraudulent circumstances, resources that hadn't existed in 1987 when Margaret had first started knocking on doors. She had time now. For the first time in 37 years, the doors were opening instead of closing, and she had time. On the Friday of that first week, Crow drove out to his salvage yard after dark and sat in the small office where he kept his desk and his logbooks and a photograph of his parents that he'd had since 1998. He sat for a while without turning on the light. His sister had been taken in 1978. His parents had been told she died at birth. They had found out the truth in 2006, 3 months after his mother passed, which meant his mother never knew she had a living daughter somewhere. His father had spent 2 years after that revelation trying to find her through whatever channels were available to a 74-year-old man in rural Kentucky with no legal resources and no institutional support. He had died in 2009 with no answers. The Whitfield Foundation's records went back to 1961. The federal agents had confirmed that the archive in Unit 34 included placement records through 1991 under Gerald Sr.'s operation. Crow had given them the year, 1978, and a name. Calloway, infant female, born late spring. They hadn't found it yet. The archive was 60 years deep, and the search was methodical and would take time. He didn't know if his sister was in those records. He didn't know if she was alive. He didn't know her name. He knew that a tin box kept under a floorboard by a woman who died without seeing justice had just opened a federal investigation into the organization that might hold the answer. He knew that a child in her grandmother's boots had walked through a diner door and placed that box in his hands. He didn't know what to do with that yet. It was too large to hold all at once. So he did what he had always done with things too large to hold. He picked up the part he could manage, which was tomorrow, and he set the rest down carefully beside him, and he let it wait. The Henderson baby came home on a Monday afternoon. Her name was not recorded in the story because it didn't need to be. She was 4 months old. Her mother, 24 years old, met the family services advocate at the door of her apartment holding a car seat in one hand because she had not unpacked it. She had never been able to bring herself to put it away. The advocate set the baby in the car seat. The mother sat on her apartment floor and held the car seat in her lap and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I need to know who stopped it." The advocate said, "A lot of people, but it started with an 11-year-old girl and her grandmother's tin box and 3 months after the arrest, on a February morning when the frost was still on the windows at Cinder Hill Road. Edna Mae Hargrove sat at her grandmother's kitchen table. Her kitchen table now, in the sense that she and her mother had not changed anything in the room, and probably wouldn't for a long time, and did her homework. She was in 6th grade. She was good at history, better at reading, working on math. She had a teacher named Mr. Avery, Thomas Schoolhouse Avery, who had put in for a substitute teaching position at Milford Creek Middle School in January and had been called in twice already, who had told her class that primary sources were the most important documents in history, first-hand accounts, things written by the people who were actually there. Like Grandma's box, Lily had thought. She had not said it out loud. She had written it in the margin of her notes and looked at it for a while. The tin box was in the federal evidence inventory now, documented, catalogued, part of a case file that would take years to fully prosecute. But before it was transferred, Crow had done one thing. He had taken Edna's final note, "Find the bikers on Route 9, and had it mounted in a small frame, the kind you find at a hardware store. Simple wood. Nothing expensive. He had given it to Lily on the Sunday after the arrest, with no ceremony and no speech. "So you remember what she knew about you before you knew it yourself," he said. The frame sat on the kitchen windowsill, in the morning light, next to the yellow curtains with the small white flowers. There is something this story keeps returning to, and I want to say it directly before we close. Not as a lesson written on a chalkboard, but as something true that I keep thinking about. Edna Mae Hargrove was not powerful. She was not wealthy. She had no legal credentials, no institutional standing, no one in a position of authority who would return her calls. She was a woman in a small Kentucky town who watched something wrong happen to her neighbor and spent 37 years refusing to let it disappear, not because she believed she would see justice, but because she believed someone eventually would. She built a case for a person she hadn't met yet. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the largest things a person can do. And Lily, 11 years old, wearing boots 2 sizes too large, having been turned away by every official door available to her, walked into a place that looked frightening because a dead woman she loved told her to. She trusted the instruction. She carried the box. I think about the people in our lives who built things quietly and without recognition, who kept records that no one wanted to see, who filed complaints that were closed without being read, who spent years being called paranoid, being told their grief was distortion, being thanked for their concern, and then shown the door. They were not wrong. They were early. And I think about the moment when someone, finally, pulls out the chair and says, "Sit down. Tell me what you brought with you." That is the moment this story is actually about. Now, because Edna's records were real, and the system she was fighting is real, and there may be someone watching this right now who needs to know where to go. Here is what the evidence in that tin box can teach us: how adoption fraud happens, and how to protect your family. Predatory placement schemes most commonly target young mothers during the 3 highest vulnerability windows: immediately after birth, during acute financial crisis, and during domestic instability. The Whitfield Foundation exploited all 3. Its family advocates were not social workers. They were recruiters. And their primary tool was the same one Gerald Sr. had used since 1961. Complexity presented under time pressure, without independent counsel present. If you or someone you love is approached by a placement organization, these are the questions to ask before signing anything. Is this agency licensed by the state? Every legitimate adoption agency in all 50 states must carry an active state license, searchable online through your state's Child Welfare Department. Has the license lapsed? Administrative extensions, like the one the Whitfield Foundation was operating under, are a red flag. Are you being asked to sign more than one document? Read every page. The 2-document structure, one labeled temporary and one labeled permanent, is the oldest trick in fraudulent placement, and it works because the temporary document is placed on top. Is independent legal counsel present? Not the agency's attorney. Your attorney. If an organization discourages you from having your own legal representation present, stop. Leave the room. That discouragement is itself the answer. If you suspect an adoption has been processed fraudulently, whether you are a birth parent who believes you did not give informed consent, or an adoptee trying to understand your own history, these are the resources that exist specifically for you. The Child Welfare Information Gateway at childwelfare.gov maintains a state-by-state directory of reporting mechanisms and legal resources for birth parents and adoptees. It is free and current. The FBI's tip line at tips.fbi.gov handles adoption fraud that crosses state lines, which, as Smoke found in the Foundation's own filings, happens more often than most people realize. Interstate involvement makes it a federal crime, which means federal investigative resources. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST, 1-800-84-35-678, covers cases where children have been placed without proper consent and families are searching. And if you are a birth parent who signed under duress or without fully understanding what you were signing, depending on your state, consent given without independent legal counsel and under conditions of misrepresentation may be legally challengeable. The time limits vary by state. Do not wait. Contact a family law attorney as soon as possible. Many offer free initial consultations, and organizations like the Child Welfare League of America at cwla.org can help connect you to legal resources at no cost. There are 62 years of records in a storage unit on Route 14 in Milford Creek, Kentucky, now in federal custody. For some of the families in those records, there may still be answers. For some of them, it may be too late. For the Henderson baby, it was not too late. By 72 hours. 72 hours. That is what a paper towel, a tin box, and an 11-year-old girl in her grandmother's boots were worth. Edna Mae Hargrove is buried in Milford Creek Municipal Cemetery, Section C, 3rd row from the fence. Her headstone is simple granite, name, dates, nothing else. Her daughter Carol picked it out. On the Sunday after Gerald Whitfield Jr.'s arrest was confirmed in the local paper, someone left flowers at the headstone. Not a bouquet, a single stem of dried lavender tied with a strip of leather, the kind bikers use to wrap their handlebars. Nobody saw who left it. Nobody needed to. If this story stayed with you, if something in Edna's patience, or Lily's courage, or the way Crow pulled that chair out made you feel something you needed to feel, share it with someone. The person you know who has been carrying a tin box of their own, who has been told their grief is distortion, who filed the complaint that was closed without being read. Let them know there are still people who pull out chairs. And if you're watching from somewhere that has its own Milford Creek, its own long-running wrong that everyone around you has learned to live with, drop a comment below and tell us where you're from. We read every single one. Subscribe to Valiant Bikers, because the real ones don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather, and they drink bad coffee at a corner table, and they fold their newspaper when a child walks through the door and tells them the truth. This has been Valiant Bikers. We'll see you in the next story.